Welcome, everybody, to the Orange Wheel Podcast, the podcast where we support business leaders in navigating the monetary transition. I'm joined today by Amos Ben-dor. Amos is a Bitcoiner who's also a specialist in corporate procurement, where he's been working with companies in the UK for a number of years. Amos and I had the privilege of meeting at Bedford at Cheat Code earlier this spring, and again in Prague last month. So it's really great to have you on the podcast, Amos. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thanks. And thanks for having me on, Ted.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So maybe for the audience, it would be great if you could just provide a quick introduction to who you are, maybe a little bit about how you got into Bitcoin and where this kind of bridges between your professional life and your Bitcoin life.
Yeah, so I work in the procurement space in the UK. I've had some different jobs in the public sector, and I work in a private company now called Foodbuy. I've had Bitcoin I first purchased Bitcoin in 2022, but I've not been a Bitcoiner since very early 2024 when I got orange pilled by James Dewar from Bridge to Bitcoin. And at the moment, my job isn't to do with Bitcoin, so I have a very separate. There's a very kind of definite line between my day-to-day job and kind of outside of my work when I'm take an interest in Bitcoin. But I'm quite interested in the strategic shift in how companies will start to see Bitcoin and take it on to their risk registers, and how they will adapt to the shift that we're emerging. You quite often call the monetary transition. So those organizations that see it in advance and take strategic shifts early on is quite interesting to me.
Yeah, great. And that's where I think you and I share interest. Yeah. I think it's also the most fascinating thing ongoing in the world today, alongside AI and a lot of other cool things, space flight and travel and all this. But with that, then you released a paper on LinkedIn earlier this year. And I guess maybe there's 2 points here. One is this kind of division between your professional life and your kind of Bitcoin curiosity and interest. But I guess it takes a little bit of courage to kind of like go and publish something on LinkedIn and put yourself out there. I mean, what was that experience like in terms of kind of being able to want to go out and publish something so that all your colleagues and professional relationships can see your interest in Bitcoin?
Yeah, it was interesting for me because I don't, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think Bitcoin is obviously a very new space. It's been around for 16 years or so. I don't think there has been an analysis of Bitcoin through a procurement lens. So I was quite interested to dabble into that. Kind of one, for me, it was an interesting thought experiment for me, because part of that piece was to imagine how might procurement operations look if Bitcoin was being used. But also, I guess, a thought-provoking piece for my network to think about. A lot of my network aren't in the space and don't think about it day to day, or don't think that Bitcoin is serious. Putting my name next to that, I'm not the biggest name in the world, but putting my name to something and saying, hey, I think this is something that you should think about. This isn't weird internet money. This is a serious piece of technology. And I think those two perspectives being interesting for me, but also encouraging people to think about it, even if they dismiss it, it's at least they have to think about it. So I think those are the two angles from my perspective to put that out there.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that word that kind of resonated with me is provocative, right? Because it can be provoking to people in both the positive sense and also maybe the negative sense too, that some people automatically have a bit of an antagonistic response to Bitcoin for I think just misinformed reasons. But I think we need more voices like that in the world in terms of just provoking more open thinking towards Bitcoin, especially in the spaces like procurement, where there hasn't yet been, I think, too much attention from the media and from the Bitcoin community put into that discipline. I mean, of course, the treasury side is getting a lot of attention right now, but I think it'd be great to hear from you. I mean, where do you see the benefits of Bitcoin being applied to the procurement functions within businesses?
Yeah. So the general idea behind Bitcoin, I think, the ownership of Bitcoin gives you a fantastic hedge against inflation. Bitcoin is the best hedge against inflation that's ever existed, in my opinion, because of its incredible scarcity means it holds its purchasing value. Although I use the term scarcity, I don't actually think scarcity always does Bitcoin justice, because it's more than scarce. It's actually completely fixed. I equate scarcity in my head to gold, whereas Bitcoin is extra scarcity. It's fixed. So Bitcoin can maintain purchasing power over time because one Bitcoin will always equal one Bitcoin, whereas fiat is the opposite. It loses its purchasing power over time. You'll often hear phrasing like one British pound today buys you 70p's worth of goods back in the day. So £1 doesn't always equal £1. So this inflation that we get in fiat creates risk in procurement, because inflation is a constant risk which procurement teams have to grapple with, because especially in high inflationary environments we've had since COVID, there's a regular need to renegotiate contracts and renegotiate pricing, and that creates a lot of instability for procurement teams.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I guess it's interesting. When I did my CFA, which kind of I remember like way back in the day, level 1, there was this whole thing on, FIFO and LIFO accounting, right? And then there's whether you kind of account for the items on the books with the kind of first one, first out, or last one, first out. And this can create quite interesting distortions simply because of the tendency towards inflation in prices and costs, right? So it's just interesting to see how much complexity, I guess where I'm going with this is there's so much complexity built into how we account for things and how we do things simply because we deal with a devaluing currency across the entire planet. So I think I see this. And so where if we get a bit more specific into how this works, I think that same principle applies to, treasury, of course. Any excess cash a company kind of has, any retained earnings, it makes much more sense to store that in Bitcoin than in money market funds or cash equivalents or whatever else. Yeah. But specifically for a procurement department, how is it that you kind of envision these, the nature of the contracts and so forth evolving as companies maybe migrate more towards a Bitcoin standard way of thinking?
It definitely, I don't think it's straightforward either way. So you alluded to it with your earlier comments, but in a fiat-based environment, if you're budgeting for the long term, it's quite hard to do that in a high inflation environment. We know that the value of the currency is going to inflate, but by how much? Whereas Bitcoin has got an incredible track record of appreciating in purchasing power as it becomes monetized. It's sort of the same problem in reverse. Rather than how do you budget a deflating asset, how do you then budget for an inflating asset? Personally, I would rather budget for I would rather budget for a deflationary asset like Bitcoin. It rises in purchasing power. It's a nicer problem to have. But I think procurement teams will in that scenario, procurement teams will need to think creatively of how they set contract prices for long-term multi-year contracts, where procurement appreciates in value. There will need to be a mechanism within contracts to account for increasing value in Bitcoin. So the prices paid to suppliers will actually decrease over time when accounted for in Bitcoin, to reflect the new value in Bitcoin as time goes on.
So I think what strikes a chord with me a little bit is, debates I often hear with, Bitcoin skeptics who are friends of mine as well. And when it comes to like labor specifically, right? So I think you can talk about procurement of labor as, an input into a business, but they tend to say, okay, people psychologically want to see their salaries go up in nominal terms, in whatever the currency is they're being paid in, they want to see the number go up over time. And if we were in a Bitcoin standard, then their labor contracts would, I guess, necessitate that the amount of Bitcoin they get per hour does go down, right? But I'm kind of of two minds of that. I'm kind of like, first of all, what employees have to do now in the inflation environment is every single year they have to try to demand and fight for some sort of pay rise just to keep up. And the Bitcoin kind of puts the power back in the hands of the labor providers, because now it's more that the employer has to kind of justify why their salary should go down, right? As opposed to the other way around, where the employees are constantly having to kind of argue why they need to
very
go
interesting.
up. So I think that's interesting in that regard. I guess, and again, I was not a procurement expert. You kind of talk about the kind of contract lengths. I mean, I can imagine that companies can, like, if they're in a position where they expect the prices to go up higher in the future, there could be a driver for them to, or incentive for them to try to actually procure more in the near term than in the longer term. I mean, how do you sort of see this kind of like short term versus long term thinking kind of playing out in the procurement side on a fiat versus Bitcoin lens?
So can I clarify the question?
Well, I just think it's like, is there a risk in the fiat system that there's an inefficient procurement strategies because of the distortions in the devaluation of the currency?
Yeah, I think for those that I think it's hard to, although there might be an incentive to front run debasement in fiat by procuring certain goods early, in advance of any debasement. I think that's inherently risky because currency debasement is uncertain, and rather than Bitcoin, which is transparent, fiat value is decided by often unelected people in closed door rooms, and those suits will decide what the money supply is going to be by setting monetary policy. Because there's a lack of transparency and a lack of there's a lack of democratic process over that. It's inherently uncertain. I do think that there's a risk. I do think that there's a long-term versus short-term predicament which procurement often has to grapple with in high inflationary environments, which is that because of the very short-term nature of fiat inflation, it often feels like firefighting. So there's a regular need to keep your head above the water and not lose purchasing power. And I think that there's definitely risk within the space of procurement tilting their focus towards quite short-term benefits versus long-term benefits, as you've alluded to. So there could be risks that procurement teams will focus overly on cost reduction in order to survive high inflation. And that drive towards cost could be at the expense of supply resilience or quality or even relationships with your supply base. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's actually because there isn't so much need to focus on the short term because you're not operating in a high inflation environment. It actually enables procurement team to focus on more long-term strategic benefits like the three things I mentioned: quality, supply resilience, supplier relationships. And the other aspect of a Bitcoin environment for procurement, which is worth mentioning, which I think might be quite interesting for the audience, is in any sound money market environment, over a medium long period of time, what we should be seeing is a reduction in prices, because as productivity improves and you see technological improvements as well, as you see technological improvements and productivity improvements, the cost of goods and services should always be going down. But in a fiat-based environment, while that process can still take place, it is counteracted by the debasement of the currency, which serves to inflate the cost of those goods or services. So although we might see deflation because of technological improvements, it's not always seen.
Yes, there are certain cases where it becomes more dominant even than the credit expansion, right? Like we see electronics coming down in price, typically speaking, televisions for periods of time, right? But I totally agree. It's an interesting kind of mismatch between this natural tendency of the free market and competition that should be driving price down and quality up, and then the fact that we have this constant need for credit expansion in a debt-based monetary system. There needs to be more and more units that it actually more than negates that effect. It's a total pity.
Exactly. And I think that for procurement teams operating in the world of acquiring goods and services for their company, operating in a deflationary environment ultimately will mean less risk, because rather than focusing on short-term benefits like cost reduction or overly being concerned with those as a priority, procurement teams will be able to fully bank those productivity and technological improvements and to benefit the company rather than having it cancelled out by currency debasement.
Yeah. And I think intuitively I can understand how this could work in practice, right? Because I guess there's kind of short-term thinking where it's kind of like, okay, we need to renegotiate contracts more frequently because prices are constantly changing and going up. So we're going to actually go out to tender for contracts every year now or every 2 years. And then you're constantly changing your suppliers and you kind of lose that benefit and the innovation that comes from kind of longer term relationships and thinking. And so I can definitely intuitively imagine why this would result in better quality offerings, deeper relationships with suppliers, more trust in the relationships that can evolve through time. If this inflationary kind of risk is kind of extracted from the decision-making process.
Absolutely.
Super cool. Have you gotten any sort of traction yet in your kind of discussions, either in your own company or with other procurement specialists or professional networks? Is this kind of idea started to kind of get some people thinking about how this could be kind of implemented in practice?
Not really is the short answer. I mean, I have had some conversations, but it's not clicked for anyone. And that's not to say it wouldn't do in future, but yeah, no is the short answer.
Okay, good. I guess that's kind of logical I think it's probably makes sense that procurement is maybe not the first place where Bitcoin adoption would naturally take place in most circumstances, I would guess, simply because that long-term Bitcoin is still relatively volatile today. And I think many procurement practices still have a fairly high turnover of their procurement. So I think the benefits are not as easily realized as things on Treasury, where it tends to be held for longer periods of time, where that long-term valuation benefit is more obvious, I suppose.
Yeah. I also don't think that the UK environment, many people feel a need for Bitcoin. I mean, were it to be understood, there might be more demand for it. But if we were in a country where the currency had more obviously failed,
Yes.
I could go to the boardroom and say, look, here's a really great solution to the problem which we're currently having day to day. I can't really walk into the boardroom of UK companies and say that. That's not to say that currency debasement doesn't exist in the UK. It most certainly does. And everyone can see it. And, I'm constantly hear talk that the prices I'm seeing in the supermarket are not the official inflation figures. I think people have an intuitive sense of that, but it's not as obvious to people.
Yeah. I do wonder, I'm always a little bit surprised, and we'll see if things do change here in the next little while, but you'd think that, as you mentioned, like companies that are trying to operate in countries like, let's say, Turkey, Lebanon, other countries that do have very, very high inflation, if those businesses don't start implementing Bitcoin for things other than just payments, right, actually applying it to corporate finance, because I think, as you brought up, the benefit is much more pronounced in these types of environments versus the UK or the EU or the US, et cetera, and developed countries with more stable currencies. Still bad currencies, but slightly less bad. Okay, cool. Let's maybe shift gears a little bit. If we kind of zoom out a little bit out of procurement and into a bit more corporate adoption more generally, where do you kind of, just in broad strokes, where do you kind of see the future going in terms of corporate adoption? What do you think some of the biggest implications of the corporate adoption of Bitcoin will be, and which companies stand to benefit the most by adopting a big lens earlier?
Yeah, I actually have quite a bullish view on this, and I sometimes even with other Bitcoiners, I kind of I don't often hear them being as bullish as me, but in my opinion, I see corporate adoption as inevitable, because the analogy which I like to use in my head is that if you're a corporate entity in one of those said country you mentioned that have more obviously failed currencies like Turkey, Lebanon, etc., it would be in your economic interest to use a foreign currency that held its purchasing power better, for instance, the US dollar. That would be a more sensible currency to save in. Whereas the way I see with more stable currencies, for instance, the British pound or the US dollar or the euro, etc., I see Bitcoin as a better money than those, in the same way that the US dollar is a better currency than
Turkish lira.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So although it's not as obvious to, one observer might say our British currency or the euro is much better than those failed currencies. Actually, they are being debased and they are all heading in the same direction. It's just some are heading there faster than others. So when people do realize that, when inflation becomes more obvious to people, there will be an Overton shift, and companies will want to shift their value into the better money. And I see that as an inevitable process, because capital always flows into the hardest money.
Totally agree. And I think that what's slowing it down, I suppose, is the inertia that comes with a fairly ossified financial system, and one that I think is quite fragile as well, right? It needs to, it's my own perspective, it's maybe more robust than I initially anticipated, but it's if things start kind of falling apart, there's going to be this tendency to want to kind of like protect the existing system. There's also just vested interests. There's also politicians that taking the money printer away from politicians or central banks that also, anytime power, because I think it's more the power shift. These things are never typically rapid, or if they are rapid, then they can be quite violent and volatile. So I think it's better we have this kind of slower, more inertia, more peaceful transition than a rapid but chaotic one. So I think I do tend to agree, and I think that's a little bit of an interesting debate in the community as well, is like this inevitability-ness. I also tend to believe it's inevitable, but also some people interpret that as meaning, well, it doesn't take any work. It'll just happen through like the free market, so to speak. And it will happen through free market forces, but it's still going to be people having to kind of build businesses and work to kind of enable that transition, I suppose.
There is a bit of a contradiction at play where for many people, they might look at Bitcoin, or, companies may assess it and think, well, is this serious? It's not been around very long. It's unproven, it's volatile. We're not going to put our money into it. Whereas those same people, if Bitcoin was was much further along in its monetization, they might see it as less risky because, this is established, it's been institutionalized, sovereign wealth funds have embraced it, governments have embraced it, which actually already has happened to some degree already. Actually, this is big enough now that it's got a track record and it's safe enough for us to put our capital there. Unfortunately, there can be a contradiction that some people have some cognitive blockers that say, actually, we've missed a boat. It's too big now.
Yes, that's always funny, right? When you hear people saying it's like, no, now it's too late. It's more about, I guess it's a retail thing more so than corporate, because I think corporates don't, I think that there's probably less of that kind of bias, but I do find it interesting with retail people saying like, oh, it's too late. I think simply because people, again, don't recognize really what it is, right? They don't realize that this is something we're really at the beginning. If it's going to be a huge value shift, only 0.2% of global capital has really migrated into Bitcoin. But I think most people tend to always think about these things as being like trades, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, there's a ramp up and then it's a bubble and it pops and then we get out, right? Like they don't realize that some things are outside that. It's a whole new paradigm shift, and it's something that people haven't really seen before. And it can indeed be something that really continues to increase forever, so to speak, right?
Yeah, but I think it will need to reach a certain size before companies see it as credible.
Do you think it'll be like a tipping point scenario where it becomes like fairly quickly within the span of a couple of years, it goes from being the contrarian position to the consensus position within corporate adoption? Or do you think it's going to be more of a drawn out thing where just gradually each year more and more people come on in a more kind of linear fashion? Any perspectives there? So I think one of the issues that we've definitely seen from a systemic level, caused by distorted money supply and interest rates, is this propensity for central banks and politicians to typically want to have lower cost of capital to kind of run their economies hotter. And that drawback is they end up having this very large misallocation of capital. And we see lots of symptoms of this in the corporate world. The most obvious, one of the most pronounced ones is being the rise of zombie companies. Do you have any kind of thoughts on, this issue and how you think Bitcoin might work to resolve?
So I think that I think that the fiat structure of our monetary system does create a lot of structural risk for the way that procurement teams have to operate, and hidden risks as well, I should say. So the problem and I kind of speak from a macro perspective as well, is that there's a risk that there's a reality that companies are often reliant on cheap, easy credit in order to survive. So we live in a world where money can be created out of nothing, and money debasement by governments is an occurrence that is a non-stop occurrence. And this creates a lot of risk and fragility in the marketplace, because you'll have companies that are hooked on cheap, easy money to survive that aren't necessarily productive. So in a typical sound money system, money would be filtered so that it could be allocated correctly. So typically productive companies with an appropriate level of risk would be in receipt of capital. But when we live in an easy money system where credit is easy to get like we have now, that distorts that typical filtering process that we might see. So unproductive companies can easily get their hands on money just as easily as productive ones.
Yeah.
And it can be quite hard from a procurement perspective to distinguish where the hidden risks are. There may be zombie companies who are loading on cheap debt, just enough to, say, pay interest rates to keep their easy credit, but not necessarily enough to be productive. So there is actually a very good textbook example of this, which certainly people in the UK procurement space would be familiar with, which is a large company called Carillion, who in 2017, 2018, they went under. They had really large amounts of debt. And being in the public sector at the time, I remember this quite well, and it created a lot of media headlines because they had over 400 public sector contracts. They were a massive construction engineering company because they were underbidding in a lot of contracts and then losing money on those contracts, but sustaining themselves with cheap, easy credit. Eventually they folded. It's just for anyone that wants to see an example of what I'm talking about. It's a classic example because it wasn't spotted by procurement teams, and they grew and grew and grew until eventually to the point where subcontractors demanded upfront payment, and then they couldn't provide that, and then they went under. So whereas on a bit in a Bitcoin standard, companies wouldn't be able to survive on cheap, easy credit. So you would see a promotion of sound, productive businesses who are creating value, not just those who are limping along because they can get cheap credit. So ultimately, this would create less hidden risks, and procurement needs to operate in a stable environment where not only costs can be stable to enable budgeting, but stable supply bases as well, where there isn't a need for disruption because suppliers might disappear overnight because the macro environment changes and those policymakers have decided to increase the cost of credit slightly, and so it ultimately creates a more stable environment and more productive, sound supply base.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting perspectives there on that, on kind of bringing this, as you said, hidden risks associated with zombie companies that can actually, it's not just the company itself, but the supply chain or the value chain that's within that it can cause problems within. And I guess this also kind of creates almost especially when companies like Carillion reference have public contracts, it almost gets this moral hazard, right? If you're a zombie company, your best way to survive isn't necessarily to become profitable, but it's to make yourself indispensable by getting lots of contracts with the government, so that you're kind of become too big to fail in a way, and then depend more on what bailouts than anything else. We see that in Canada, where I hail from as well. There's these companies that just are constantly getting bailed out by the government, and there's every time it happens, this time we're going to change, we're going to do something fundamentally different, and it never ends up being the case. Instead, they pay out their executives big bonuses, they siphon the value out, and then they demand to be bailed out because they're kind of providing an essential service. And I think there's a lot of interesting issues in this regard.
There's an interesting analogy I've kind of heard before, because what we're talking about is fragility, because you have companies that are reliant on cheap credit. And the analogy I like is it's like a Jenga tower. So ultimately it might look big and spectacular, but really it's fragile. If you remove a piece, the whole thing can collapse. And that's just what we have at the moment. It's a good illustration, which I quite like.
And the money supply is like the glue. Just putting glue all over that thing, right?
More glue as the money supply.
It's like an unlimited supply of glue. You can just create more and more glue, right? Until the whole thing's just glue. Yeah. I think the other thing that kind of I tend to think about when I hear about this too, zombie companies, is I do wonder if under a Bitcoin standard, it'll literally be less, at least what we consider today to be jobs, right? Because you ever think there's many companies that probably shouldn't necessarily exist that are kind of value destroying, that are just employing a lot of people. But, we tend to think, everybody needs to have a job, everybody needs to work 40 hours a week. But I wonder if, we get to a point where people actually can work less hours for the same or better kind of quality of life than what we have today as well. It's because that's, as we brought up earlier, right? Technology, productivity improvements driven through the free market should bring costs down, should bring labor productivity up. Why? That's also income. We see prices going up. And we also see the amount of labor required also going up, right? And it just seems inconsistent with the way things should happen, right? We should be able to, develop tools that make our labor more productive so we can work less time. But it's just not working that way. So I think that's another kind of thing I think about when we think about, I sort of see Bitcoin as almost like cleaning up a what's become a fairly like messy economy, one that where we have fewer but like much healthier, productive businesses and jobs and so forth.
Productivity is actually the enemy of fiat-based monetary order, because productivity would actually bring about deflation. As people become more productive, costs go down. But in a fiat-based world like we have, when we basically rely on debt, it's a debt-based world. A deflationary environment would be catastrophic when you have the whole world is reliant on debt, because you need the inflation to inflate the debt away. And that's how governments and tick along. So not that I have a big answer to this, but if we do become more productive, certainly with AI, who you mentioned you're very interested in as well, that dynamic is going to be really interesting, because AI is obviously the bringer of extra productivity.
Yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to kind of delve a bit deeper into, is the whole AI angle. In your paper, you also talked about the rise of AI agents and how they'll be most likely executing more economic activities in the future. It's quite fascinating. So, and you make mention that they will probably not have bank accounts. They'll probably transact more likely in something like Bitcoin. So maybe just elaborate a bit more on your thoughts about that intersection between AI and Bitcoin, and how you think that might unfold in the future.
So what my thinking was there is that in order to transact today, to open a bank account, you need to demonstrate a legal identity, KYC, know your customer. But Bitcoin is famously permissionless. Anyone with an internet can access it, and there's no sign up, there's no KYC. Any entity essentially using the internet can theoretically transact on the Bitcoin network. So does that create the possibility for AIs to use it, because they have no legal identity? So I didn't expand on it much in the article. I left it at that, but it was just interesting perspective for people to think about, and perhaps build on as well, because I don't have all of the answers.
Yeah, no, I think it's a conversation that I'd like to hear more of those AI thought leaders discuss in a way, right? Because I think it's highly likely that AI autonomous agents will need to transact value amongst themselves and also with humans to a certain extent. And I think that's an interesting leap in the way we think about ourselves and our relationship to AI. When we look back, there's no other animals on Earth that use money within their communities, right?
Yeah.
But now we're creating something that's non-human that is probably also going to be using money and transacting amongst themselves. So it's really interesting to think about what that really means from a kind of like a sociological and philosophical perspective as well, in terms of how we kind of look at ourselves, what makes us really human in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously the kind of interesting thought experiment here is you might have an AI transacting with Bitcoin if you have a AI humanoid in the future that's walking around getting your shopping for you. But if they are acting on based on instruction from a human, that's one thing. But if they are transacting autonomously, that's something entirely different, and that's something which I think is quite mind-blowing for me to think about. That we're quite far away from that happening, because, well, at least in humanoid form, but AI humanoids. But it's really interesting to think about.
Totally. And I do suspect it'll probably happen even prior to. It doesn't necessitate humanoid robots, correct, I believe, for this to kind of happen. So it might happen even before that point. Really fascinating. I think that's giving me some food for thought that I might want to kind of get an article written with some ideas on this topic, actually.
Yeah, it needs someone to expand on it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So just kind of looking forward into the future now, what do you have planned in your own, professional or Bitcoin life going through the rest of 25 into 26? Things you want to do more in the kind of Bitcoin and procurement space. I noticed also you recently did a bike ride from London to Paris, which seemed pretty cool. You could do more of that sort of stuff. Yeah, maybe tell the audience about what that was all about and your plans for the future. What excites you most about Bitcoin and procurement, and where you see it going in the future? What gets you really excited when you look into the future?
To be honest, I am excited and motivated in terms of my own spare time as well, is the shift that I know will happen in the UK. There's currently the UK. You're in Denmark, I presume, at the moment. I'm not as knowledgeable with Denmark. I'm more familiar with, or the EU. I'm more familiar with the UK, where there's quite a negative attitude towards Bitcoin. I think it's equated to gambling by a lot of people. Whenever you want to buy Bitcoin, all of the regulated warnings you get are telling people you risk losing all of your money by buying Bitcoin, which is absurd because Bitcoin's a mature technology and it's been around for a long time. It's been through many tests and trials and tribulations, and we're well beyond the point of it going to zero. I think those who think Bitcoin's going to zero don't understand, haven't properly looked into the asset. And I'm quite interested in being part of changing the regulatory landscape in the UK. So I do kind of, in my own small way, I do write to the UK government departments and regulators who are in charge a lot of these regulations that are quite negative tones towards Bitcoin, and in fact don't actually understand it, because our regulatory environment actually it does not distinguish between any of the digital assets. So it doesn't distinguish between Bitcoin, stable coins, and meme coins. They are all the same thing in terms of how they're regulated.
It's a total shame, right? And I feel like that's almost globally still that case, right? And only now in this year when the US is actually starting to kind of versus for Bitcoin and other things. So I hope the rest of the world's going to follow that. But I think that's also going to be a major step forward for Bitcoin to be isolated as really the only one that really isn't a class of its own from a regulatory standpoint. Really important. Yeah.
I would definitely like to say to the audience, my argument in favor of Bitcoin's uniqueness is not hinged on this, but as a kind of supportive annex, those who kind of question Bitcoin's differential properties to other crypto assets should read the quite brief strategic order which Trump signed, I believe, in March this year, which quite clearly separates out Bitcoin from digital assets, which I personally like to refer to sometimes, because what's your basis for drawing this distinction? They're all cryptocurrencies. Oh, actually, the American government agrees with me.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice shortcut for people who still trust governments, right? Yeah. Because the better way is to actually say, you can go into more technical aspects, but it becomes a long conversation for the uninitiated.
Yeah.
On your point, the reason I'm kind of looking at my phone is because some news just came in here related to exactly what we're talking about, which is that the UK's FCA, its financial regulator, has just announced that they're going to open retail access to Bitcoin and other crypto exchange traded notes, ETNs. So that's a step forward.
Yeah, I played a little role. I responded to their consultation on that.
Okay.
So I mean, they suggested to allow retail. It's the first time that their suggestion in the consultation was to lift the ban on retail crypto products, so including Bitcoin. They suggested to allow exchange traded notes rather than ETFs, which many people pointed out doesn't make sense because there are differences between the two, and ETFs are less risky. It never made sense to me that Bitcoin was a regulated asset that you could buy in its raw form, but you were banned from a retail product buying it. It made no sense to me.
Yeah.
But in their wisdom, FCA decided to do that. But despite, I've not read their response that you've just seen as published now, but their suggestion in the consultation was that we lift the ban on retail products, which they've done, but we do not change the classification of how Bitcoin is treated from regulatory standpoint compared to other crypto. So they are still regulated the same. Yeah, so I won't say that. But I appreciate it's a global problem, like you've said, that regulators don't distinguish between Bitcoin and other digital assets. But in your original question, in terms of what infuses me, I'm quite infused about doing my bit to educate the regulators and explain why their stance is wrong and to change them. I have a lot of motivation and time to try and do that.
That's awesome. That's a really important function, right? I didn't actually realize that you had been engaging with the UK regulators on these topics already. So I think that's a really great service to provide to the community.
Yeah, and some of the responses I've received from either regulators or government departments are hopeless. They are terrible responses, but which don't engage with my points. But like we said at the very beginning, you're in a good space if you're provoking people to think about it, and you're at least making people write a response, even if they ignore what you say. It still puts it on people's minds.
Certainly, and I'm pretty impressed with the work that Freddie New and Susie, the UK Bitcoin Policy Institute.
Fantastic.
I think I've seen. Yeah, they're really great communicators. They're having the right conversations. So I'm excited.
I follow their leads. When they post, we need to put pressure on the regulators to educate them, and they say what they're doing, like responding to consultations. I follow their lead. They are excellent.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess that's the top of the hour here. Thank you so much for your time, Amos. It's been a really great discussion. I've learned quite a bit, actually, new stuff I didn't actually know about you. Maybe just very quickly, if people want to kind of connect with you or get in touch, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'm happy for people can connect with me on LinkedIn if they're interested. I'm sure when you publish this, you can tag me, and yeah, I'm happy for people to connect with me on there.
Certainly. Okay. Well, then I wish you a fantastic weekend when you get there, and I look forward to having a nice discussion with you again in the coming months.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.